Welcome to You Can't Laugh at That, the podcast where we take topics that aren't funny and we prove that they are funny. This is part of the You Can't Laugh at Work series where we take that time and place where it seems inappropriate to incorporate the themes of stand-up comedy, and we find reasons why it's not only appropriate but beneficial to use some of the same skills that a comedian uses to connect with an audience and to be successful and to find humor in any given situation, and how that works in terms of a leader doing the same thing. In fact, some of the skills mirror one another. And in today's episode, we feature Reid Carr, the CEO and founder of Red Door Interactive, which started in 2002. It is an advertising and marketing agency that has grown tremendously since 2002. They are known for their 100% jerk-free workplace environment, which means they focus on a culture of open-minded acceptance and respect 100% of the time. In this conversation, we discuss how connecting with your team, how building trust amongst your coworkers and your employees is just as vital as building trust and connecting with an audience as a stand-up comedian. So I hope you enjoy this episode of You Can't Laugh at That, You Can't Laugh at Work, featuring Reid Carr. Now, I noticed on the website for Red Door, the word meaningful comes up quite a bit, and I assume there's a lot of intent behind that. Meaningful experiences. Let's create something meaningful together. I mean, that's consistent messaging. How would you define meaning to your team?
So we talk about it a lot, and what we recognize is that meaning actually comes in different forms depending on what matters to the individual. And so we spend a lot of time trying to understand what our kind of win-win relationships need to be. So what's the win for the client? What's the win for you? What's the win for the business? And how do we find that kind of connection between all those parts? So we talk about one of our core values is exceed. As we talk about exceeding expectations, but the only way to do that is to understand the expectations. If we understand what those expectations are, a win is not always perfectly clear, because to one person, while we may say, I may want to ascend the corporate ladder, someone else, a win is having more time with family. Mm-hmm. And so in the sense of identifying meaning, it is hyper personal as it relates to that human part of it, which can reflect itself in a brand. For example, we believe about putting humanity behind a brand and identifying what meaning is to them and how do they create a connection to their consumer or customer.
So as I'm editing, I realize that I can basically paraphrase what Reid is saying. For example, when he was talking about the definition of meaning, that can be attributed to what it means to be a comedian. For example, funny comes in different forms depending on what matters to the individual. So as a comic, it's important for you to make what matters to you matter to the audience in a way where they're looking at it from a different point of view. When we make people laugh, it's our brain's way of saying, I've never looked at it that way before. I don't know what voice that was, but that's the case. If there's ever like a shortcoming in that, like how do you identify when somebody isn't finding meaning in their work or finding or a client isn't connecting with that?
There's a lot of different ways that shows up. I mean, for example, one of them is priorities change. I mean, if you've had kids or if you've gotten married or if you bought a house or if you've done any of those things, you may realize, or actually, and I will say oftentimes that you don't necessarily realize it until later too, that maybe your priorities have changed or what matters to you changes. Obviously the environment can change, create new pressures on you. So whether or not that's coming from the inside. So, really a part of that is just having that frequent dialogue and having the degree of empathy and having the strength of relationship with those around you, which includes, again, client and agency as us, or your manager and direct report or something to that effect, and having those frequent conversations to have and trust to allow someone to say, hey, do you think maybe something's changed here? And because then they're saying, oh man, like what happened? Why am I not finding meaning? It's because I used to think I was trying to ascend the corporate ladder, but now I've had a family and I realize that that's taking away from the experiences that I want to have at home. Wow, I did, like, and so, hey, like, do you think it's that? And that has to come from a place of trust, because
Mhm.
what you don't want, someone brings something like that up who you don't trust. They think you're out to get them, that you're changing the rules of the game, or any of that kind of stuff. So this has to come with a consistency. Like if you just did this so if you don't have, for example, regular one-to-ones with your manager, and have a consistent set, we have a consistent agenda that you have. If you're always asking the same question, it's a way easier. It's way easier to identify when things change. If you're always just ad hoc of like, what's going on today, then who knows? It could literally be what's going on today, or it could be the macro definition of today being the current environment or the year or something like that. But if you have these things of saying, where's your mind share right now, for example, and if you have that, we do that every single day. That includes part of our daily huddle agenda. And all of a sudden you're like, you know what, man, like, you said this the last 4 days, what about this, your mind share, where your head's at right now, you want to talk about it. And those are the kinds of things. That's when I think you recognize there's a conflict. You had meaning and didn't have meaning. That's when that stuff tends to happen. It's not like you never had meaning and thought you did, or something like that. I mean, all of a sudden you're just like, something feels off, and it's because something changed. Something probably changed.
Right. It doesn't smack you in the face. You're not just like, I'm not getting meaning out of my work today.
Right.
Like that's not a
Exactly.
that's it's not a thought somebody has.
No, and again, I think sometimes people, like, it's maybe a resistance to things changing, right? I mean, again, if you've had
Oh yeah.
kids, you're like nothing's gonna change, and then like a few years later, you find like, okay, yeah, things definitely changed, and they changed a year or two ago, not and you were kind of maybe resisting it. So again, having that support system, the kind of scaffolding we talk about, the things that are around each individual to support the ever-present change, to have those authentic conversations, it makes a huge difference to identify, to have someone tell you that and go like, wow, man, wow, yeah, something maybe did change.
Yeah, and just the questioning too. Eventually, they have to answer it. Especially if it's consistent.
Mm-hmm.
When Reid says that priorities change, it's so true. Not only from an employee standpoint, but the sensibilities of the time continue to change. Some jokes that were acceptable 10, 15 years ago aren't acceptable anymore because people are more in tune with mental wellness. And doesn't, mean to say don't challenge your audience, but make sure that they come away from the exchange better than they were when they got there. And knowing that people's sensibilities are changing, knowing that what's meaningful to them changes, you have to adapt with that if you're going to continue performing as a comic. Otherwise, you're going to be, doing hitting watermelon like no one Gallagher hits watermelons with a mallet, like that gets old. Another thing that he mentions here is consistency. If you're a comic that is known for being clean, and suddenly you start talking about sex, your audience is going to turn on you. It's one thing to evolve your style with the times. It's another thing to talk about something that isn't in your character. Just suddenly. If there's going to be a shift, let it be gradual and natural. If you do that, it breaks trust. And trust, not only from a leadership standpoint, but from a comedic standpoint, is vital to your success as a performer. You mentioned things like trust, and that is, I mean, I don't want to say it was a taboo word for so long, but it's these very human elements that we're now addressing in the workplace. And there are a lot of businesses, a lot of organizations that are still hesitant to lean into that because it's not quantifiable.
Right.
You can't put a number on trust, these soft skills like that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, your messaging has been consistent. If I were to base that off of your TED talk, like since you started Red
Yeah.
Door, years ago. So
Yeah.
what made you look at, coming out of college, what influence did you have to make you kind of look at work in a more human way?
You know, it's kind of funny because it comes from a very like mechanical, process-driven sort of a way. It's just ironic, I think,
Yeah.
right? But I'm also a believer in kind of the yin and the yang of all of this stuff and this balance. And to take that step back, I wrote a business plan for Red Door, and I kind of kept trying to distill it, and to articulate the practical aspect of it. Let's just say, a lot of service providers are paid by the hour, right? And why does someone who does the exact same thing get paid, let's say $100 an hour, and someone else gets paid $1,000 an hour? It's the perception of, and hopefully the actuality of it, but the perception of that hour from that one person is way more valuable than that hour from the other person. It might be what they do, it might be the service they provide, or certainly the quality that they're able to do, or the efficiency by which they're able to do it. At the end of the day, it came down to the person and what they're capable of doing within that period of time. So if we wanted to increase margin, if we wanted to increase our value to our clients, we better make sure we have the best damn people. And so then articulate what the best people looks like. And there's a bunch of factors that go into that. Factors being like, are they trained? Are they continuously trained? Do they have the tools they need to be effective? Do they have a support network around them for the humanity of it, right? I mean, you have your ups and downs. You have people around you to help when, whatever, or to do the lower level tasks while you're doing higher level tasks. You get down into all this stuff. And if we find great people, how do you make sure you retain great people? And that whole part of it, at the end of the day, what it all came down to is everything oriented around each and every individual person we have, making sure that they can find the best and allow them to be their best through a ecosystem of the company to be able to provide that, such that we can drive value for our clients. So at the end of the day, it's this very mechanical way of going, we better pay close attention to the humans that we've got, because that's all we've got. And I know that a lot of people talk about that too, of like, well, our greatest asset goes up and down the elevator every day and that sort of thing. But to some degree, I'm sure that a product company, while of course the people create the product or something like that, for a while they can live off a good product. And then they fall off a cliff because they didn't pay attention to the people.
Mm-hmm.
But our inventory as a service provider expires faster than any like grocery store produce. Every 15 minutes, our inventory expired, all of it. So, I think that everything we do we have to earn it and win it every single day, every single 15-minute increment or whatever increment we bill off of.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. You do a lot of creative work. You allow your people to kind of explore that freedom, what works with the client and so on. Like, how would you define creativity, and how much creative freedom do you give your people? Yeah.
So you have to realize too that we are creative for commercial purposes. So there are artists in this world that can do whatever the heck they want to do, but we're effectively commissioned to do the work that we need to do. So for our creativity to be effective, we have to have guardrails, which to a degree, I think creates, a lot of times the conditions for supreme creativity. If you just said to some creative person, hey, be creative, they'd be like paralyzed. Like, I don't know, what am I supposed to do with that? But if we're saying, look, here's the demographic, here's what they're dealing with in their life, here's the product can do, here's what it can't do, and how do I put this in the best framing to then, sell to these people who are dealing with this in their life, what would you do? And then that's where creativity comes up. And so what can we do as an organization to put the strategy in place and the constraints in place to, make creativity happen for commercial purposes? I mean, at the end of the day, if also we produce something that is creative, go, oh my God, that's catchy, or it's funny, or it's whatever, but doesn't sell product, then that's not going to work for us either. So, that's the kind of the constraints of it that I think brings a lot of the fun. I think it's also can bring some of the heartbreak too, when you think you've got something that you're like, it just doesn't, it's funny for sure, but it's not like, it's, how do we have that discipline to connect it to go, well, yeah, that's funny, but that's not for this. So, do you parking lot it? Do you hold it somewhere else and say, someday maybe we'll get to do this because that'll work for someone else? But But at the end of the day, I mean, that's what our responsibility is. And so, giving people that environment, and also setting the right expectations, particularly for the creatives, which, by the way, what's important to us, part of the 100% jerk-free core value of ours, is making sure that those great ideas can come from anywhere, not just the creatives in the traditional sense. Because I do believe that everyone has those. I mean, I don't care who you are. I think there's a lot of people who go, I'm just not creative or whatever. Everyone solves problems. Everyone finds ways to get through a day. And I think if you have that objectivity, and maybe even lighten the load of this responsibility that you put on a creative and put that to someone else, go, hey, what would you do here? They are at the lowest possible. They weren't expected to be creative, so the bar is very low, and they see it from a completely different perspective. Maybe that inspires creativity, or maybe it is the solution, in entirety. So that is where you create a trusting environment where you throw an idea out, and people go like, maybe it's not it, but at least they're going to respect you for trying. And sometimes it is it, and that's what's the great part of it.
Yeah, at the very least, it's a starting point, or you figure out, well, what not to do in some cases.
Yeah, for sure. We've just eliminated. Thank you very much. We've eliminated one possible direction we could have gone.
To me, I come from an improv background, and you mentioned that in your TED talk. But at the same time, you can yes and while still saying no, and that takes a special skill in itself.
You have to have a perspective, right?
Yeah, yeah. Everything you say, like I said, I'm a creative. And if I sit down and I'm like, all right, David, write something hilarious, or write something that's going to blow people's minds, I'll just sit there with a pen and have no idea what to do. So you got to operate between rules and a blank canvas.
And sometimes one of those rules is the deadline.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we need it by then. I know. Once you give me a deadline, I'll crush it. But if you give me no deadline, I'll sit with it forever. Now, when Reid says that there have to be guardrails when it comes to being creative, the same is true when it comes to writing content as a comic. There are some topics that, based off of who you are, what you look like, what your background is, that could be off limits. And trying to approach those topics, there are some ways that work and some ways that don't, and you have to be aware of that. There are guardrails in place. Even though a comic can get on stage and talk about whatever they want, doesn't mean they should. And in order to be more marketable, in order to give the audience the best experience, you have to know where your limits are. Just like when you're creating a marketing campaign for a client, or you're doing PR work for a client, or you're dealing with a difficult person, there are certain things that you can and can't say. You can say whatever you want, sure, but there are guidelines, there are guardrails within which that you can work to get a better outcome, and you can still engage your own creativity. Also, when it comes to ideas that are funny but might not be relevant to a certain project, that's true of writing content as a comic. There is a joke that might be funny, but it might not fit in your current act. You might not have the skills to really extract all of the funny juice, never going to use that in a sentence again, from a certain topic, because you don't have the skill set, you don't have the experience to do it. So just like Reid was mentioning, you can parking lot an idea, you can put it in the save for later bowl, and when you're ready, bring it out, or when the situation is perfect, there it is, waiting for you, ready to be used.
You can't laugh at that.
You Can't Laugh at That is brought to you by Water Cooler Comedy. Now, for too long, we've been asking the question, should work be focused on work or fun? But Mark Twain once said that work and play are two words used to describe the same thing under different circumstances. So my point is that we're asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, should work be work or fun, the question should be, how can we make work fun? Whether it's a keynote speech, a half-day workshop, a 90-day consulting program, a customized corporate comedy experience for you and your team as you try to figure out how to reboard, how to get back to work after working virtually for a year. Why humor in the workplace? Well, studies have shown that humor builds resilience. It allows us to adapt to problems more quickly, more creatively, and more It allows us to adapt to problems more quickly, more creatively, and more I can't say collaboratively. It allows us to adapt to not being able to say collaboratively correctly. Because not only does laughter make us feel better, it makes us work better too. So why not make work the time and place to laugh? Check out watercoolercomedy.org. You talk about the 100% jerk-free zone. That doesn't just mean like no assholes. There's a lot of layers to it, and one of them, you talk about the rule of improv, which is yes, and when someone presents an idea, you accept that idea and add to it. How does that play in the day-to-day culture building of your team? Not just the ad work, but but
it's interesting how it plays out. I mean, how you witness it sometimes is people actually having to almost force that, right? Because I don't know if that's always human nature. I think that if it was human nature, I think we'd see it way more often than we do.
Yeah.
So you really do have to be trained in the idea of like, hey, one, it's you have a perspective. You are who you are, and so we respect you for who you are and the perspective you bring. And this other person presents their perspective and the value they bring. So when you put these kinds of things together, having that idea of one, you're trying to make each other look good, and two, you want to make sure that you're kind of building upon one another's ideas. Now it's certainly can you find tangents that need to bring things back on the rails, go, hey, we're going on the wrong direction on this one because we've yes-anded it down the wrong path. Because
recognizable.
Yeah, which I think works on possibly on stage, but not for commercial purposes part of it. You're like, now we're getting off strategy here. It's funny, the puns are great, but we need to get back over here because we're not trying to be funny for this concept, perhaps, or something like that. Because that is you have those cases in which you're like, look, this has to be serious, not funny, or whatever that might be. So, in any case, that's how that plays out. Is you have to have those people that are effectively the topic keeper and the timekeeper and some of those people within these contexts of the brainstorming, if you want to call it that way. But then you also have those forced things where someone says something and you clearly when they disagree, they go, yes, and then they're like, and you're like, and you're like, okay, I see what you're doing there. Whereas it's a lot, if they are truly yes-anding someone, then it's just more natural where they're just, oh yeah, totally. And then we could do this, but then they're like, yes, and maybe we should, and at least at that point, everyone recognizes they're trying and they're trying to be respectful. And so those are the kinds of things that it's like, talk about the idea of like symbols, that we have a lot of symbols in our environments that they mean things to people. And that's a symbol, maybe in that case, verbal one, that says, look, hey man, I respect everything you put out there. And I think something different. And it's too much on me to try to piece it together. So, and it's like, it means a lot when someone just forcibly says yes, and you're like, all right, cool. Like, I see where you're going with that one. And I think that's one of the ways that it plays out. I think other ways that it plays out, like I said, I think it's just hopefully become something that people just generally embrace. And it just is a generally respectful environment in that way.
Yeah, there's plenty of time to get analytical and poke holes in it. But when you're trying to be creative, that just destroys that process.
Yeah, exactly.
Right now, everything going on in the world, there's a lot of adversity. There's a lot of pivoting that's having to be done. If you could give a leader that is trying to lean into it using the principles that you use as a leader, what would you say to them? What advice would you give them?
Well, I mean, I think if you're trying to, the uncertainty and having to find new directions, I think generally the answer is within your people. I mean, assuming you have people, I mean, a leader of an organization with, more than just yourself. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of times there's the aspect of confidence. I think there's also the understanding and empathy of the customer and the core customer. Are you reaching the right people? Are those people, because I recognize in this environment, there are just things that have largely gone away in this time. And you're like, no amount of changing things up is going to make a particular office reopen, and that's the kind of service you provide or something like that. So, you have to really put all your assets on the table and go, what are we really good at? What do we have? And again, having one perspective generally isn't enough. Having different people go, well, like our operations department's really good at doing this one thing. Like, okay, is there something there? Let's lean into that and talk about what that is, and could that be something different? I have been inspired by a lot of people well prior to this. I'll say back in the last major downturn, so the recession, and to watch some people pivot into completely different places because they're like, well, we happen to be good at this one thing. Where else uses that one thing? And find new industries. I mean, it's not that it's not hard, but I think it is that way of creativity, exploration, understanding your constraints, and getting enough people who, under crisis, you'd be surprised how many people come through and say, look, I'm on board with you here. Let's try to figure it out. Now, if everything full collapses, then everyone's going to have to find something else. But it's not through lack of openness and transparency. I mean, that's not how that's going to happen. They're going to be like, oh man. I think that's been a big thing for us, is giving people the information. We're a very transparent organization. And I firmly believe, as we always say, is none of us is as smart as all of us. And so if we can figure out and put all that information out to everyone on an ongoing basis, we can find those new avenues, hopefully before crisis happens.
If it doesn't work out, you can still use those same principles and adapt to it. Everything you said, it's funny. Like, I mean, I have this comic brain, but everything you said, those like principles of stand-up apply there too. I mean, yes, and communicating, collaborating, trust, confidence, all these things. So I don't know, maybe hop on stage and try stand up at some point, because you've got the basics down.
Well, that's what's funny is that's my son's passion.
Oh, really?
He's almost 16, and that's comedy writing. He did his 8th grade, whatever you call that, thesis he interviewed a writer from Modern Family. That's his thing. He's super into it. So I've absorbed quite a bit of it now that it's become such a passion for him.
Yeah, that's super cool. Well, thanks for taking the time out of your day again.
Of course. And I see the happiness advantage back there.
Oh yeah. Well, that's the book that got me into wanting to speak in the first place.
That's great.
Yeah.
I had a chance to meet him. And then his book came out later. And yeah, we have that. So we have a library at Red Door, and that's one of the featured books that we've got.
That explains a lot. That explains a lot. All right, man. Well, be safe out there. Thanks for taking the time again.
Yeah, you got it. It was a pleasure. Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye. Likewise.
You can't laugh at that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of You Can't Laugh at Work with Reid Carr. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about Reid and what he does with Red Door Interactive, you can visit Red Door at reddoor.biz. That's REDDOOR.BIZ. You can also follow them on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and on Instagram at Red Door Interactive if you're interested to see what kind of work they do. You can follow Reid Carr on Twitter at iCowboy and on Instagram at RDICowboy. Thank you again to Reid Carr for joining this podcast to help share what it means to work in a jerk-free zone and to allow creativity in a way that is productive and engaging and human on its deepest level. As we continue on our mission to incorporate humor into leadership in more workplaces, to engage more people, to inspire creativity and collaboration and caring, feel free to give us a like, a follow, a subscribe on whatever platform that you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple Podcasts, throw us a 5-star rating and a review of the way that you found these episodes to be helpful, because we want to prove that no matter how quickly change comes, no matter how uncertain the future is, no matter if your people are working from home and you're trying to find new ways to engage them remotely, remember that there is always a way to laugh at work.